Ok, bom, bem-vindos todo mundo. Para quem é a primeira vez, esse é o Grupo de Estudos em Economia Comportamental, o G.E.E.C, que a gente se encontra uma vez por mês para discutir temas de economia comportamental. E na edição de hoje, a gente tem o prazer de receber a Sarah Conly para discutir um pouquinho sobre paternalismo, coerção e algumas liberdades. Meu nome é Flora e eu organizo o grupo junto com o César, o Arthur, e quem tiver interesse em entrar, a gente tem um grupo de WhatsApp onde a gente se comunica e também tem a página do Facebook, página do LinkedIn e o site onde a gente posta informações sobre os encontros. So, Sarah, thank you so much for being here with us today to discuss a bit. We're big fans of your work. And I think today's discussion is going to be really interesting, especially given the time that we are at, where these discussions are really important to be made. So I'm going to pass the word to Cesar to introduce you and introduce the theme. Thank you.
Okay, so Sarah, thank you once again for being with us. I don't know if I'm talking in English or Portuguese because we're mainly talking to the audience, so I'm going to introduce you in Portuguese. Bom, então, pessoal, eu sou o César, também faço parte do G.E.E.C e é um prazer receber a professora Sarah aqui. E eu entrei em contato com a obra dela pela primeira vez quando eu estava montando a ementa de uma disciplina da qual algumas pessoas aqui foram alunos na USP. E a gente recomendou um artigo dela, um artigo que está publicado na Behavioral Public Policy. E, bom, enfim, a Sarah tirou o bacharelado dela pela Universidade de Princeton, fez o mestrado e o PhD pela Cornell University. E hoje ela é professora no Baldwin College, no Maine, nos Estados Unidos. E ela vai falar um pouco para a gente sobre essa questão da relação entre paternalismo, coerção e a banalidade de algumas liberdades, né? Será que todas as liberdades têm a mesma importância relativa? Essa é uma das questões que ela discute. E por causa disso ela atraiu muita polêmica, já foi chamada de a Stalin loira, Hitler, algo assim. E, enfim, agora nós vamos ouvi-la sobre isso. So Sarah, I was just introducing you and talking that you have attracted a lot of polemics and critics. And you've been called some bad names. And why is that? So I guess we're going to figure out now that listen to you. So the word is yours.
I don't know why people call me bad names, but they do. I've been called Hitler a lot, Mao, this and that. I get a lot of hate mail, you know, and I am like an elderly lady in a little town in a very small state, but I get a lot of heat. So why? I am a paternalist, which there are different definitions, but in my case, it means I think that it can be morally right and in fact morally obligatory to interfere with people's choices in order to get them to do what is good for them, which to me seems pretty straightforward. But as Cesar says, some people object. So first, I'll give you a little background, and then we'll get to where I am and perhaps why people hate me. So when I started teaching philosophy in 1980, I had come from a philosophical tradition that says humans are rational agents. We can figure out what's right and what's wrong. Sometimes our emotions lead us astray, but if we can just think clearly, we'll do the right thing. And somewhat coincidentally, while I was teaching at the University of Michigan, that was my first job, I decided to quit philosophy forever. And I thought I wasn't interested in the research that I was doing, which was largely meta-ethics. I just didn't find it gripping. So I quit. I had a tenure track job. I don't know how it works in Brazil, but in the US, you get a job for 6 years, and if they like you, you have a job for life. I quit. I didn't come up for tenure. I was like, philosophy is not for me. I'm out of here. And for the next 20 years, I didn't have a full-time job in philosophy. but I did live in the world. And as I did that, among other things, I had children. And as I interacted with people in normal life and not with academics, it became clear to me that people are not as rational as I had been taught. The idea that pure rationality is your normal baseline from which we sometimes deviate in extreme circumstances was wrong. So I remember watching my son play what we call soccer, what you call football. And, you know, all the parents are madly concerned about the outcome of this game being played by 8-year-olds. And it was clear that if the ball went out of bounds, people couldn't even see correctly whether it had gone out because of contact with this team or with that team. It all depended which team their kid was on. So they would always say, it was out on the other guy. It was out on the other guy. And they weren't lying. They just couldn't even take in the information because they wanted it to be out on the other team so that their team would get the throw in. So I found myself changing, you know, as a result of life experience, my view about people's baseline rationality. And to think sometimes we can be rational, but especially when we have something at stake, we aren't very rational. It's very hard for us to take in information, even something straightforward like who last kicked the ball, and especially something more complicated if we kind of don't want to believe it. Like, are cigarettes bad for you? Well, if you don't want to believe it, you're going to find yourself going, no, there's all this reason to think they're fine. Okay. So I was out of philosophy about 20 years, but then I ended up divorced and I needed money and I didn't have any skills, but I had a PhD in philosophy. So I was looking for a job. I didn't want to leave where I lived because that would have been difficult for the children. So I applied for a fellowship at Harvard and I applied for the job I now have at Bowdoin. And as it happened, I got both of them. So I went to Harvard. Harvard at that time had a visiting professor named Cass Sunstein, who is now pretty famous for writing about paternalism. I'd never heard of him. I didn't know anything, but he's a nice guy. So even though I was this nobody whose most recent activity was cutting up oranges for the kids to eat in the middle of the game, he suggested some readings, because I said, I'm interested in this idea that people aren't all that rational. And he was sort of like, tell me about it, you know. So he gave me things to read. And I read them. And he, meanwhile, was writing a book, the book Nudge, which then became very well known. His book came out. I read it. I liked it a lot, but I thought he didn't go far enough. So Sunstein says, yes, paternalism is good. It's okay to try to change people's preferences. That is to say, he wants to do this, but it's really bad for him, so let's just make that less attractive. It's okay to change people's preferences if that makes them better off. And what is it to be better off? He and I accept what's called a subjective view of welfare. That is, what makes you better off is the ability to achieve your own goals, which I agree with. But Sunstein said, it's okay to interfere in certain ways with people's choices, but you should not take away their liberties. So you can make healthy food more attractive. You can put it in the cafeteria where people are more liable to choose it. You could make it cheaper by subsidizing growing it. It's okay to interfere with people's choices, but always give them all the options that they had, just make some more attractive. And I read that and I said, so far, so good, but I think we need to do more sometimes. Sometimes we need to coerce people. We need to make them do the right thing. So if it's cigarettes, I would say make them illegal, ban them. That's coercive. It takes away your option. And I would say, too bad. Most people really want to be healthy in the long run and do the activities that you can do if you're healthy. We should ban cigarettes. We shouldn't just make them a little more expensive or put labels on them that say smoking is dangerous. So I came out saying what he says is good, but we need more. We also need to coerce people at certain points. So I wrote a book called Against Autonomy. Autonomy can mean different things, but I took it to mean against freedom of choice. Of course, sometimes you can choose freely and it's okay. But in other times, I think it's okay to interfere. And we can talk about when it is and when it isn't. And that got quite a lot of attention, given that, you know, I'd been out of philosophy all this time. And I was also asked to write for the New York Times newspaper, which in the United States is the most influential newspaper. And I wrote because in New York City, the mayor at that time was proposing to coercively ban large sodas, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, because they're bad for your health. You could still buy it, but you had to buy a smaller glass. You could still get just as much, but you had to get 2 smaller glasses and not 1 big glass. And the soda companies were against this because they knew that people don't really want a big soda that much. They kind of get it, because when you go in McDonald's, they automatically say, wouldn't you like a big one? And you go, yeah, I guess so. So I wrote for the newspaper on that. And again, I got letters saying, you're taking away my liberty. And of course I was like, your liberty to drink a big soda? Who cares? But people do care. So I've gone on since then to focus more specifically on liberty. So in my book, I said, look, if it is better for you to take away cigarettes or to ban large sodas or to ban all soda for that matter, it's okay to do that because the value of your health is more important to you than the transitory pleasure of drinking a soda. Now I'm focusing more on, so whatever is the value of liberty? Why does it matter? Does it matter if you have the liberty to drink a soda? Why does it matter that you have the liberty to vote? I do think that's important, but I'm just saying, why? In the United States, we, like you, have a pandemic. We have a president who is like an idiot and who for a long time said you shouldn't have to wear a mask, even though we know, in fact, that's good for you. And now a lot of people are politically motivated to say, I have a right. It is my liberty not to wear a mask, even if I'm in a store that says you have to wear a mask. I see these people. The store says you must wear a mask. They go in without a mask. No one says anything except me because I'm obnoxious, but I can't make them do anything. So it seems to me this topic its importance is clear right now when what we do individually has so much impact on other people. And I would argue you don't have the right not to wear a mask if that endangers people, amongst many other rights. And that's because whether liberty matters or not depends what that liberty gets you. The liberty to vote, I think, is important because I think voting is important. The liberty to wear a mask is not important because not wearing a mask doesn't get you anything valuable. Masks are a little bit inconvenient. I know, I teach with the mask. Okay, but I would still say, so what? Whether a liberty is important depends on two things. How valuable is the activity that you have the liberty to pursue? And also, I think, how likely you are to pursue that. If the activity is not valuable, the liberty is not valuable. If you're not likely to pursue it, again, the liberty to do that is not valuable. So the value of a liberty is a function of the value of the activity it allows you to do and the probability that you will do it. Okay, that's a lot of English. I am sorry. People say Americans only speak English. I do actually speak Spanish and French, but I do not speak Portuguese. So I'm very sorry you had to hear this long thing in English. And these guys could translate when I am not clear. So I am open for questions or objections or whatever.
Great,
Does
Sarah.
anybody want?
Go ahead.
No, you can go, Flora. Just ask if anybody wants to start.
Okay, so if anyone has questions or comments or did not get any part, you can put in the chat or you can open your mic and ask something. So I'll start with some questions. In our last meeting, we were discussing about like the weirdness of behavior economics and how behavioral science, I mean, and how those differences might affect how we perceive the field. And one thing that I was thinking of is that the whole definition of libertarian paternalism is really centered in the liberty values of USA. So I think like in the US, the liberty as a value for itself has a way bigger importance as a government value. Here we have a lot more paternalistic policies, such like voting is mandatory, or a decade ago we were discussing about banishing smoking in public spaces, which is something that has been done, that has generated discussion at the time, but now it's accepted. And sometimes I read texts about just that they are like discussing nudges for this in the US and the UK, and they say why it's not mandatory. Or I think a lot of policies regarding behavior are more mandatory here than other places. And I'd like to know how do you perceive this difference in these values, and if maybe behavioral science could have taken another approach if the liberty value in itself weren't so in such a high extent, because I know Sensing and Teller were really careful about shaping it so it would not be in any political side of the spectrum.
Yes. I think certainly it is true that many countries other than the US accept more paternalistic policies in more areas. However, I think the same question comes up in every country, because in every country there are some liberties that people don't want paternalistic interference. So there's still going to be this question, even if you say, sure, ban trans fats, as Switzerland did, who cares, why not? Then there will be other questions where people will like, okay, I don't think you should interfere here. So here's one, as far as I know, no one wants interference, which would be in your personal relationships. So say that I am a mother, and say my son is going out with someone and I'm like, no, bad choice. Most people would say, well, at least in the US, I shouldn't have the ability to determine what he does if he's an adult, as he is. So in all countries, I think there are cases where we're like, no, personal liberty here is off limits. You shouldn't interfere. And again, I would say, okay, let's look at that. Are you right or are you wrong? Now, I have a written question I see from Amanda saying, who decides what is important? Which is a good question. So as I say, like Sunstein, I believe in what is called a subjective view of welfare. That is, what is good for you, your welfare, consists in you achieving what you want. The problem is that a lot of us are conflicted. We want to live long, healthy lives, but we also want to smoke. So first off, the paternalist has to say, which of those is really more important to people? Well, let's say, leave out people, to you. And what we might do is look at your behavior. You know, what seems to motivate you most of the time. If you don't like being healthy in general, you don't try to be healthy, and you say you don't want to have children and live a long time and hang out with those children, and you kind of like being outside when it's cold and smoking, and we might go, okay, maybe for that person smoking is good. But for most people, when you ask them, at least, that's not what they say. They say they'd like to smoke and be healthy, and given the choice, they'd rather be healthy. What they say is they think, well, they say different things, but some people say, I think I'll be okay. I'm smoking, but I think my health will be fine. And a lot of people say, I think maybe I won't be fine, but it's too late. I'm addicted. I wish I'd never started. So those later two answers would make the paternalist think, okay, for this person, smoking is not a good choice. Once you're addicted, you do want to smoke. But before that, your life doesn't seem particularly diminished by not smoking. It's something that once you get into it, it's hard to give up. Whereas most people antecedently want to be healthy and do the things that health allows you to do by like being active, accomplishing your career goals, hanging out with your kids or friends or whatever. So nationally, how do we do this? In an ideal world, if we had full information about everyone, we could craft laws that says Flora's allowed to smoke because she really cares about it more than health, more than longevity, more than activity. But Caesar isn't because his values are different. Unfortunately, laws don't work like that. That is, we just don't, practically speaking, we can't yet come up with laws that vary from person to person. So we craft laws that reflect what is good for the majority. That's true in paternalism. That's true of all laws. You know, we have laws against stealing people's televisions. Some people might be better off if their television was stolen. But we don't have enough information to say it's okay to steal Cesar's. He's wasting a lot of time. Well, so we just do a general, you shouldn't steal people's TVs because by and large, seems like a bad idea. So that does mean with any legislation, there are some losers. There are people that legislation does not make better off, whether that's paternalistic legislation or third-party legislation, legislation that is geared to keep you from being harmed by other people. But the way life is, it is given the practicality of legislation, that's the best that you can do. I see some people don't know how to open their mics. I think you just have to touch something. You guys would know.
Yeah,
I guess since Sarah was answering Amanda's question, we can follow the order of people that asked that. So Roberta, and then Pedro, and then José, and then the order in the, if Roberta, you want to talk.
Okay, now the mic is on. Sarah, thank you so much for your talk. It's my first time in this group, but I've been thinking a lot for years. I read your book, I read your paper, Paternalism, Coercion, And I have some worries that maybe you share, but I want to hear from you. My fear concerning paternalistic interventions, light ones just as sustains, the nudge ones, have a great deal to do with ethical issues, epistemic issues, okay, and practical issues. You said you make bold claims, even though pretty defensible, but how a policymaker can manage the epistemic, the knowledge problem? Can he really know what is truly valuable to individuals? Something more fundamental than that, Sarah. When you go on making things simpler to people, or you say, okay, I know what is good to you, or you pretend because you have some commitments to some vested interests, some cronies, and so on and so forth. Can't you hurt people's ability to think? And I think the human condition has a great deal to do with the ability to think, to be in control. It's not, please don't get me wrong, I don't really think it's all about the number of options, okay? But all the unintended consequences that in countries like the ones like Brazil, with very long history of fragile institutions, some interventions can make people really worse off. What is your reaction to these issues that I tackled?
Yeah, I do focus on government intervention, and we should always be suspicious of the government. You can never just trust the government. That's a fact. But I think that although even in a democracy, many bad laws get made, by and large, we haven't said, let's not have any laws, because it has seemed better to have laws than not to have laws. And what we do when there is a bad law and it becomes apparent that it's a bad law is change it. And that can be difficult because once a law has been around for a while, people start to accept it even if it's a bad law. But still, we think we need them. So the United States, never mind paternalism, just in laws about not hurting other people. You know we have had bad laws. So we have laws that have been badly applied. So it is the case in the US that Black people are more liable to get a harsh sentence if they are found guilty than a white person. They're sent to jail for longer. Okay, that's obviously bad. But instead of saying we're not going to send anyone to jail, what people try to do is address that. And it's difficult, but supplying more public defenders so that people have good lawyers, allowing certain sorts of evidence and not allowing certain sorts of evidence. So in any kind of law, it can be a bad law or it can be a law that could have been good, but it's used badly. But I think with experience, we find again, we can improve them, and we're worse if we don't have any laws. So here, for example, we have a government agency called the Food and Drug Administration. And they basically are supposed to test medicine before it goes on the market. And they also test food for purity. They have agents who go out and see if meat has E. coli. When that agency was first suggested, many people objected to it. It was very unpopular because they said, who are these people to decide what medicine I should take? How do they know what's good for me? And it's a fair question. And at times, I think the Food and Drug Administration has made bad decisions. They've taken too long to allow a drug onto the market. But at the same time, as far as we can tell, looking statistically, they have also saved people from wasting a lot of money on drugs that are no good. And sometimes they've saved them from drugs that would have hurt them. I don't know if you remember thalidomide. That was a drug that pregnant women took for a while, and it caused the babies to be born without limbs. That did not happen in the US because the United States FDA did not approve the drug. Some American women got it, but they got it in other countries. So that was good. But, it requires constant vigilance. I don't trust people. But, that's true of all laws. They can all go wrong. And yet, I think on the whole, we have agreed it's better to have laws than not have laws.
Pedro?
Yeah, I think that my question is very much in line with Roberta's. I agree with you that restricting certain liberties can lead to socially desirable outcomes, both on a collective and on an individual level. But your defense of those restrictions seem to rely on a widely agreed upon concept of values and widely agreed upon scientific truths. And don't you think that a priori assumption that liberties are valuable can lead to protect the average citizen from arbitrary decisions from governments that do not share in those values or believe in those truths? You yourself have been critical of Donald Trump in this very meeting. Don't you think that, for instance, an assumption that liberties are valuable can protect someone from Trump's decision?
I think that we need to assume only that some liberties are valuable. I think assuming somehow they're all valuable, for one thing, it doesn't even make sense because there are going to be conflicts of liberties. So you immediately have to saying, well, which one is more valuable than another? So my liberty to hit you, okay, I can't do that here, but say you were in front of me. Most people would say that my liberty to hit you conflicts with your liberty not to be hurt against your will. And so we immediately go, okay, we need to make a decision, which of these liberties should be respected. And as far as I know, the decision most places is your liberty not to be interfered with is more important than my liberty to swing my arms or practice my karate punch on your chin. So we certainly can't assume all liberties have equal value because we need to prioritize them because conflict is inevitable. So I would say what I'm doing is going, okay, one more step. If we assume that not all liberties are equally valuable, that means that there's something that makes one liberty more valuable than another. That means that there's something other than the mere fact that it's free that gives a liberty its value. And then I go, okay, it seems to me that when we're doing this, when we're saying the liberty to vote is more important than the liberty to hit people on the way to the voting booth, what we're saying is the activity of voting is more important than the activity of hitting people in that context. And then you'd say, well, why is that? And it's because we need to vote in order to have a democratic government and people can express their opinions and that exercises some control over the government. you know, so that the value of that liberty is determined by what you're doing with it. And that in itself has so much liberty that we, for example, would say the value of voting is more important than, I don't know if it's the most important, you know, but it's very important and outweighs my liberty to do something way to the voting booth or even harass you in the US anyway.
Okay, so Jose, I can see you from here, but if you are online, if you want to elaborate the question you wrote.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Professor Conly. Just one question. Who says how valuable a liberty is?
I do think that cannot be objectively determined. I don't even know if there is such a thing as objective liberty. So what I would do is look at what the people themselves value. And as Amanda, I think, was pointing out, that's not always easy. You know, sometimes it is easy. I think other times it's not easy. But you know, when it comes to something like smoking, we see how much money people spend on quitting smoking, which in the US is a ton. We see that parents tell their children not to smoke instead of saying, yeah, it's great, you know, please do it. They accept that schools don't allow smoking, that people manifest through their behavior. They manifest more than one thing, but they show a lot of values through what they do. And, you know, that might be a problem for me because I do think voting is important. And in the US, not everybody votes. I mean, many people don't vote. I'm hearing a noise, maybe it's, okay. Many people don't vote. I guess I still think it is important. I think the ones who don't vote don't do that because they don't care what the government does. They think their side is going to win anyway, so their vote doesn't matter. Or sometimes they think their side's going to lose anyway, so it doesn't matter. But it's not that they're actually indifferent to the outcome. And so, which is why when there's a tight race, often you see more people voting, or when there's an issue people are excited about, more people vote. My guess is that this year in the US, there will be more voter participation because the country is very excited about the election. Well, they are. Not about Biden so much, but they're excited. So we'll see. But I mean, all of these are good questions because a lot of paternalism rests on our ability to make good epistemic claims about what people want. And of course, people do express themselves through voting. So that's one way of determining what they want. You know, but it is complicated. But I guess I'm going to take the conversation back a step. So there are two big questions about paternalism. One is, if we accept that it's okay in principle to make people do what lines up with their actual values, there's a practical question: how can we know that? Good question. But that first question is important. If you think it's morally okay to make people do what is good for them, even when they don't want to, my job is 99% done. Because I'm, you know, a moralist. I'm saying, okay, you agree with me. Liberty's not that important. You're just worried that we'll make the right decision. You're not worried about paternalism. You're worried about, are we going to come up with the right paternalistic policies? And that's important. And if we could never do that, I grant you, maybe we should never be paternalistic. But if you will grant the moral principle that it is okay to interfere with you as long as I'm doing that in a way that on the whole promotes you living the way you want to live, then you're a paternalist. You're just not sure if we can actually implement it because maybe we don't know enough, or maybe we have a corrupt government, which most governments are at least in part corrupt. I haven't been everywhere, but that was certainly in the US.
Okay, so Bianca, I guess she kind of talked about your question, but if you can elaborate the question you wrote in the chat.
No, I think she just answered.
I think it is like what it was Jose. Yeah, I mean, there are people, philosophers, who think we can make objective statements about value, about how you ought to live, regardless of how you feel about it. So Martha Nussbaum, whom I like a lot, she's a well-known American. She believes in what is called an objective list theory of welfare. You're well off for her if you are able to engage in intellectual activities, and, you know, okay, but, you know, I just feel like, but what if it really doesn't matter to me? You know, she says you should have, it's a combination. But I find myself thinking, well, people are different. You know, Martha, whom I am not speaking of disrespectfully, I know her. So Professor Nussbaum, intellectual activity is really important to her. Great. Not to everybody. Some people don't care much. Some people care about it and don't care about their social lives. And she says that's a social life subjectively important. But I believe in a subjective notion of welfare, which is you are well off when you achieve what you wanted. I might amend that to say what you want when you have information. You know, if you're mistaken, that would be a different thing. But if you're informed about what cigarettes do, et cetera, and what long life will get you and so forth, then you're well off when you achieve that. And our job as a paternalist is to help people achieve that.
Cesar, can I join with a question on that? So thank you. Sarah, so if subject is like, if value is ultimately defined subjectively, like you define value based on what people are likely to do or what they like to do. So if people are likely to smoke cigarettes, you would probably regard the importance of the liberty of smoking for that people an important liberty. So
Yes.
how would you be able to defend banning smoking for people who are likely to smoke and therefore value smoking?
That, as I say, is based on the assumption that most people are better off not smoking. And we have some evidence of that because most people who smoke try to quit, for example. I mean, that, at least, again, I only know for the US, but most, the Center for Disease Control studies this. Most people who smoke try to quit. So that suggests they don't think it's worth the costs. Some people, I assume, don't try to quit. I don't know, everyone I know tries to quit, but, and for those people for whom smoking really is good, there I would say, again, if possible, we would have a law that was very individuated for each person, but we don't have the ability to do that. And so I would just say, ban cigarettes. At some point in time, maybe we could make all laws individual. So like in the United States, when you drive, there's a speed limit. That's partly paternalistic, but partly so you won't hurt other people. But realistically, it might be ideal if we had different speed limits for different people, because some people are better drivers and maybe they could drive faster. And so you go, okay, that guy can go 80 miles an hour. But me, I am afraid at this point, I'm not a very good driver. I feel I'm quite distracted. And so even the real speed limit is probably something a little too high for me. So ideally, we'd have a law that, you know, each driver or car or something would have a little sign about, but we can't do that. So we say the speed limit for most people that seems to work here is this. If you don't like it, it's not good for you, too bad. We couldn't give you your own speed limit, even though you're a professional race car driver, and you'd be fine with it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it would just be too bad.
I think that it has been noticed that like historically when like alcohol was banned in the US, that when you ban a good that people value and will try to buy it like illegally to keep consuming, you may increase illegal commerce instead of like reducing the target behavior you want to reduce. So how would you go on about that, like making it effective?
Depends. It depends on what it is. So the United States enacted prohibition for a while. Alcohol was banned. As a matter of fact, that did reduce the consumption of alcohol. So it was kind of successful, but it didn't reduce it as much as they wanted. And it had all sorts of other bad side effects because people smuggled in alcohol. So it meant that illegal gangsters got lots of money. It was a bad idea. I don't think in that case, people consumed alcohol because it had been banned. I think it was already a big part of the culture and people didn't want to give it up. I mean, if you banned alcohol tomorrow, I'd probably be one of these people trying to illegally buy alcohol. Similarly with marijuana in the United States, United States spent billions and billions of dollars on the so-called war on drugs. But there wasn't a single place in the United States where you couldn't buy marijuana. I mean, it was pointless. Banning that was stupid because for one thing, it's not clear it was dangerous. In fact, I think it wasn't, but also it was hopeless because it was too difficult. You know, marijuana came in by land, by sea, by air, you know, all sorts of ways. So it was a big waste of money. So yeah, if you think that will be the reaction, then banning it would be stupid on a cost-benefit basis. The thing about cigarettes, and I could be wrong, but I think they wouldn't be as popular because they don't get you high, right? Alcohol gets you drunk. Marijuana gets you high. We love those things. We love to be drunk and high. Smoking, usually the first time you smoke, it makes you feel kind of sick. It's not as attractive. You know, it doesn't have that deep cultural pull of, I now want to nullify part of my mind, which is so popular. So that's why I am inclined to think the ban could succeed. I don't, you know, maybe it would make it more popular with 16-year-olds because they're contrary, but I'm not sure. And I just don't think it has as much intrinsic appeal as do things that affect your mind. But, you know, I could be wrong. If it turned out that we banned cigarettes and, you know, there were cigarette traficantes and all sorts of violence stemming from that, yeah, I would go, okay, bad law, change it.
Can I just add a point to it before we go to Arthur's point? But I think it would be naive to think that government's not coercive in any way. Government is coercive, and in some societies it's more than others, but we can think about a lot of paternalistic examples in both countries, like Brazil and US and all other countries. So I think what really caught me in your argument is that the argument to defend a liberty for the liberty itself, like the liberty as an end, it does not hold you. You cannot hold on that. Like, I don't want someone to told me to do this because I have the liberty to choose, if you do not value the ends. And then the discussion in each policy should be based on how we value that policy in each case. So we would need a discussion in each case. And then what I mean is, like, for example, if we're discussing banning cigarettes, society would move towards banning cigarettes, and it would have a public debate whether it would be a good idea or a bad idea. But we cannot say, no, we will think that the government should be more paternalistic overall or not overall. So, and then what I would like to say is, do you think that societal acceptance comes before or after coercive politics?
Policy.
Yeah.
Both. So when I was young, cars did not have seat belts. And then they started getting seat belts. And then later, the state started making it required that you wear a seat belt. And in the US, it varies where you are, but most places require it. And I remember people objected to that. It was like, they're taking away my liberty to be in a car crash and go through the windshield. But now, people have gotten used to it. Once a policy's been around a while, sometimes this is a bad thing, but people don't even think of it. People just put on their seatbelt. People don't fuss. It's when a policy is introduced, all of a sudden people go, you're taking away my liberty. But if it's introduced and it's good, it works, then they stop talking about that. I think people accept seatbelts now and accept seatbelt laws because, in fact, it has cut down on the number of fatalities. So people are like, oh, okay, and don't worry. When I wrote this op-ed, this piece in the New York Times about banning large sodas, it was funny because lots of people said, I have the liberty to choose my size of soda. And I thought that was funny because if you go to a restaurant, you don't usually get to choose the size of the food you get. You don't. You order a hamburger, they bring, it might be big, it might be small. It's no one gives you that choice. McDonald's gives you a couple of choices, small, medium, large. But not if I say, well, I want exactly 7, they don't do that. And most restaurants don't even give you that much choice. And I notice this because to me, they always bring too much food, but it's like, they don't give you the choice. But people were used to the idea that in restaurants, you already don't get to choose. You get what you're given, and then maybe you complain, but that's just the way it is. But as soon as someone else was doing this, it was like, oh my God, this is this huge thing. And I think there too, they would have gotten used to it. I know in Britain, if you go to a pub, the glasses have a line on them. So when you order a beer, the glasses are all the same size in all the pubs, and they have to fill it up to that line. If you order wine, I think there are 2 choices. I forget, 300 millimeters or more. And again, there's a line on the glass because they have regularized the portion size. Well, again, that takes away a certain liberty, I guess, like the liberty of the pub owner to decide if they want to sell very small beers or big beers, but they're used to it. In the US, we don't do that. Sometimes you order a glass of wine and it's like this much, and sometimes it's like that much. But people accept that because they're used to it. So I think we very much modify what we do in light of being used to a policy, and if we think it actually seems to be working, which is true of seatbelts and the Food and Drug Administration and various other things. And then there are things people still object to, and they probably will get changed.
Maybe
Well,
we can jump to
I
the
have a question.
discussion in the chat. Oh, okay, go ahead, Santa.
No, I was just going to point out this as well, Flora, that I guess your talk made us think a lot of things. We are having a discussion in the chat as well while you're talking. There was something that Arthur said before. He asked, why aren't more people coming forward to discuss, to advance points like you are doing? Does it, I guess he wrote, is it bad for their business or something? And Arthur, if you want to compliment me. But I was thinking also about, I know you have other book called One Child, where you argue that people should not have the right to have more than one child.
Yep.
And what do you think, how was the reception in the first place of this book? Because I guess, especially in the US, this must have been very polemic. And what is the main justification for this? I guess is overpopulation. And then what kind of policy, the practical side of it, what kind of policy would you say it could be effective for it?
So that book is not paternalistic. I'm not saying that for your sake, you should have no more than one child. That's a third-party argument. That is, I'm arguing that at present, given the present fertility rate and the projected population growth, no two people together only have a right to produce one child. I'm not even sure they have that right. I say you don't have a right to produce more than one child because of the harm that overpopulation will do. Because as you probably know, based on current fertility rates, which are dropping, assuming they still drop, the UN and other organizations project a population of 9.5 billion people by the year 2050 and 11.2 billion people by the year 2100. And what we've got now is between 7 and 8 billion, which is way more than we've ever had. So most people agree that if we get that sort of population, there will probably be dire results. There may be absolute shortages, not enough fresh water, not enough food, or there may be just differences in distribution that mean that some whole populations starve while others have a lot. Differences in distribution tend to result in warfare. So we already have had wars over oil because there's a shortage of oil. We got too many people using oil. So the United States engaged in a war in the Middle East, where the idea behind our invading Iraq was that we would get control of the Iraqi oil fields and also, we thought, get lots of friends in the Middle East. Didn't work out. But that's an example where a shortage of a desired good creates conflict. It's already happening in the US over water because a lot of the Western states don't have enough water for everyone, which results in fights about who gets the water. So that was the idea behind the book. So I looked at rights theory and said, when we look at normally accepted theories about what you have a right to do, you don't have a right to do this. If it's expected, it would be this harmful. And so what I said was, there are various steps you could take. Easy step, sort of like libertarian step, would be supply free contraception to everybody. You know, make it easy not to have children. Free contraception available locally. Because this has been done some places. And if it's available right there, not even you have to get on the bus and go downtown, you don't have as many accidental pregnancies. A lot of high schools in the United States now supply contraception to the students. And it's tricky because not all the parents like that. But what they typically do is they write a letter home saying, we're going to supply your child with contraception if your child wants it, unless you, the parent, get back to us and say no. And as we know from behavioral economics, people tend to accept the default option. The default option is to let the kid get contraception, so they do that. So I was like, let everyone have contraception. In the US, you have to have a prescription. It's a big deal. You got to go to the doctor, which means you have to have money or health insurance. And then you got to go and, no 16-year-old or 14-year-old girl wants to do that. Make it free. But then I said, if that doesn't work, we could incentivize it. We could have tax breaks for people who have only one child. That doesn't apply so much to teenagers because they don't pay taxes, but some sort of privilege that they would appreciate. If that doesn't work, you could have monetary fines. You're sort of upping the pain at each step to see what would happen. We know historically that when there have been depressions and recessions, the fertility rate has dropped. That is, people are sensitive to economic pressure. So that's why I thought economic pressure would probably be enough. And in fact, another fact, as we know, some places like Western Europe and Japan, the fertility rate has dropped way more than the worldwide 2.5. So they have one child, well, I forget, it's one child plus a fractional child, 1.3 children or something. And that is partly because of economic pressure. It didn't take a government policy, it's just it costs a lot to live. Both parents need to work nowadays. Fewer children.
Maybe
so it's not paternalistic, but it is about, when does liberty have value?
Maybe now we can jump to Arthur's question. That is, he cannot make it, so I'll read it. A long time ago, I read a Daniel Riala's interview in which he mentioned what you said about how people shouldn't have freedom of choice in some decisions like retirement savings, for instance. Why don't more behavioral scientists come forward in the subject like you? Is bad for their business?
Well, Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler both argued for paternalistic policies when it comes to retirement savings. So in the US, a lot of your retirement savings are determined by the business you work for. There is retirement money given by the government, but a lot of it comes from the business. So the idea is when you get a job for a business, not all businesses do this, but they give you an option, choices for what sort of retirement you want. And you can choose that your business will put no money into your account, or some money, or more money, or it might depend how much money you put in out of your salary and do they match that, etc. And of course, a lot of businesses would rather not give you any money because then they get to keep it. So for many businesses, the default option, if you did nothing, you received nothing. And so Sunstein was saying we should change that. The default option should be something that's good for you. And if for some reason you don't want it, fine, you can opt out. It's not forced. It's just you're nudged in that direction. So people do speak in favor of it. But I think that businesses would rather have whatever is cheaper for the business. Surprise. And therefore they don't push it. But certainly there are behavioral economists who have. And similarly for the government paid pension, we get, so all my working life, I've paid a certain amount into the government, into a pension fund. I don't get that back. What I pay in goes to people who are now retired. When I retire, younger people will be paying, and that will go to me. Perhaps because of that, if you tell people they have to put more money into that fund, they aren't very willing because it doesn't come back to them. It goes to older people. So maybe we should change it. So the government takes my money, but then it saves it for me. And in that case, I might say, yeah, take even more, you know, so that I'll have more when I'm older. But it's a weird system in the US. But it varies, you know, Britain, they have a nudge office, I forget what it's called, but, you know, Office of Behavioral Policy, where they are trying to implement this, even still, I think, under the Boris Johnson's government, which is more conservative. You do get hate mail, but,
I was
but
wondering,
it doesn't do any harm.
how about the safeguards? I mean, Sunstein talks a lot about transparency, and now he's writing about he's calling sludge audits. I mean, government should be audited for sludge is like the bad use of nudges. So
Yes.
and to promote more transparency. And what else do you think? Education campaigns, or what could be done just to try to prevent?
I think transparency is a great thing. I'm all for it. It would be good to be transparent. I tend to think in the US, a lot of people wouldn't look at that information, but some would, and that might be enough to place pressure on the government, especially because some of those who would be those who have a lot of money, like big businesses, because they care too. So that would matter. I personally think we should have term limits for people who run the federal government. So we have a term limit for president. You can only serve twice as president. But for the other positions, senator or representative, you can be in there your whole life. And what that means is they need to get money from people in order to get reelected, which means they tend to do whatever their big donors tell them to do. And I think it would be better just to have them in, get them out, have them in, get them out. That would cut off some of the long-term relationships with these big donors and with the lobbyists. I think that would help. I think, well, for the US, we should also do away with the electoral college, which is a way that the popular vote doesn't always win, but that's us in particular, so.
Now I'd like to jump to a question that was being discussed in the chat, and which is about the effectiveness of coercive measures. And I would just like to link to a paper I recently read, Sunstein paper, The Meaning of Masks, in which he says he states like the things in general have social meaning, and that it is true as well for laws. And sometimes the social meaning of a law doesn't get into society, and people can also be defiant, which is something I guess Thiago also mentioned. So what makes a coercion policy effective, and what if it's not effective? Would this other kind of policy be more effective, or how would you deal with that? And if it's not effective, is it just justifiable in the first place?
Well, if it's not effective and not going to be effective, no, it's not justifiable, because the costs would outweigh the benefits. But I think it is certainly true that if a coercive policy relies on actual coercion in every case, you know, a policeman following you around, that's not a good policy. But what is typically argued is that once something becomes a law, a coercive law, people tend to think that most of their peers agree with it. That is, it became a law, so okay, I guess it must be a good idea. Now, obviously, not 100%, and that'll vary. There'll be pockets of resistance. But by and large, that seems to be true. And there's a guy at the University of Chicago who writes about this, where the force of law isn't police and prisons, that comes up some, but the force of law is that the mere fact that there is a law sends a social message. So I would say my parents assumed that marijuana was bad for you because it was illegal. They didn't know anything about it. They'd never been around it. But they're like, I guess it must be bad, because why else would they ban it? But then when it becomes legal, my parents aren't here, but I think a lot of people who never tried it are like, I guess it wasn't so bad. You know, its social profile changes. And that's important because, again, if it relies on, you know, actually catching people or threatening them, that's expensive. But I don't steal stuff, and it doesn't even cross my mind. And part of that is certainly, well, okay, I don't steal stuff. I don't think it's because I'm going to get caught. I mean, there's no police on my street. You know, I could go next door and steal the guy's bike. But stealing is disapproved of. And part of how I know that is that it's illegal. So it sends a social message. Now, again, that doesn't always work. If you've got a law, but the facts obviously are in opposition to that, then you might go, this law is just wrong. But it does have a certain normative force simply from being a law, because laws have a social message. And that, you know, it gets complicated with who passed the law and so forth. But once it's been around a while, I think people may even forget who passed it. And they're just like, not supposed to do this.
Does anyone have any further questions? Roberta, I don't know if you want to make a question about the point you just put in the chat.
Can I make a provocative statement to Sarah, only for us to think? Okay.
Sure.
Sarah, you say pretty often that people concentrate their attention on the number of options, and it's time for us to think about what is truly available. Okay?
Right.
Given all these concerns and shared with you, and I feel that you also understand that all these ethical issues and epistemic and practical, my hunch is the following. Don't you think you can also take the risk of giving too much attention to the number of options? To say that coercion is okay, that's my provocative statement. Because it's difficult to have this normative account of welfare. Okay, if a policymaker cannot really access all the required knowledge to deliver in a policy what he or she promised to the electorate, for example, how can we go on accepting for coercion? How do you sensitize people and say that coercion is fine? So that's the provocative statement I want to make to you.
I think I didn't totally understand it. So are you saying, how can we get people to accept coercion?
To make your point, to accept your bold claims, because there are lots of blanks in that.
I think people already accept it. They just don't know that they accept it. I mean, my feeling about everything I write is that its main problem is that it's so obvious, it's boring. Like, I've never said anything controversial. Everything I say is common sense, but people don't know that. Because I think if you say to someone, you know, you think all options are intrinsically valuable, and they go, yeah, you would immediately say, oh, come on, no, you don't. You give up options all the time. You know, you voluntarily give up options, right? So you buy this car, you give up your option to spend your money some other way. You do this, you give up all these other options. And you're not worried about that. You say, okay, I had all these options. I chose the option that gave me what was most valuable, even though that meant I no longer had these other options. Now the guy will say, well, that's different. That was voluntary. It was, but still, when you do that voluntarily, you yourself are saying, I'm not going to keep all my options open. I'm going to go for fewer options. You know, I could have done 15 things. I chose this one, and I chose something that meant I can't do the others. So, and often, sometimes we might regret that because maybe some of those were valuable. Other times we don't. You know, every time I get up in the morning and get dressed, I give up the option of going outside naked. I'm not worried about that because I really don't, you know, it's not an option I value. So we all do that. It's just we don't think about it because we tend to focus on the options that we think have value, and then we weigh the value. But I think we admit just having lots of options per se isn't that great. You know, and you choose according to which you think has most value. And here I'm saying sometimes when you choose, you do well. Other times you're not thinking too clearly, which is where behavioral economics comes in. And we're going to make the choice for you, given what we think your ultimate goals are. And I think you get used to that because it's not really a radically different way of thinking. We just use rhetoric that says, oh no, liberty is intrinsically valuable. But I don't think we really display that in what we do. I think we think some liberty is valuable. Political liberty, voting, that's valuable. Liberty not to wear a mask? No. And, you know, in real life, we tend to see that until the issue gets politicized, as masks are in the US, where it becomes, someone says, it's just like the right to vote. And you're like, oh, okay, I guess so. It's not. If it hadn't become politicized, no one would care. They wear a mask. It's no big deal. So I don't think it's radical. I don't think it's polemical. Why people get upset about it, I do not know.
It's like always a question of what is at stake when you make those choices, right?
Yeah, and we do that, and we let other people do that too. And many times we value that. One more example, when I buy a car, I have a lot of options, but a lot of options were foreclosed by the fact that cars have to reach a certain safety standard. I could buy a much cheaper car that was made of cardboard and aluminum foil, but it would kill me. So, you know, all these standards have already been agreed on and have already closed our options, and we don't even think about that. We go, okay, fine, I can't buy a dangerous car. That sounds reasonable. Why would I want to do that? Well, you probably would have back before safety standards were imposed.
Great point, Sarah. Well, I think I'll end our meeting here. Thank you so much once more for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you. And like my mind is now buzzing with all these thoughts, and I hope you all have enjoyed. For those who are the first time, be more than welcome to come in our next meetings. We'll probably have our next meeting by the middle or end of October. So just get in touch if you want to be in our networks. Thank you so much. Thank you once more, Sarah. And
thank you, guys. Thank you again. I'm sorry for doing this in English, and I'm grateful that you all learned English, and so that I could do this. It did work for me. So it was a very interesting conversation. I heard lots of good idea. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Looking forward for your new book.
It'll be there. So I need to take away some of my options so I work more.
Good catchphrase.
Okay. Good night, guys.
Bye-bye, Al. Have a great night.